Hey, if you listen to me much, I talk about setting my cameras to Russell-proof the process. In other words, I just try to set things where I don't mess things up. Well, I failed to Russell-proof this webinar today. And so instead of hitting the record button like I always know to do before this webinar started, I failed to do that. So what you're about to see is a replay. I'm going to do it exactly like I did earlier today. You won't miss much. The only thing you'll miss are question and answers, but I'll try to address those as I go through what some of the specific questions were that we had today. I remember the questions we had. So I'll try to address those. But again, this is a replay of today's webinar. Hope you enjoy it. Well, welcome to the replay of every five things every nature photographer should know. If you're first time joining me, again, my name is Russell Graves. I'm coming to you live from Hackberry Farm, Dodge City, Texas. A little bit later than I did earlier today, but again, this is a re-recording of the webinar earlier today, and I'm going to present it just the way I did today, and all the information is still the same. So again, it'll lack a little bit of the back and forth, but I think you'll still get the same benefit from it. So with that said, these things I'm going to talk about today are all there's probably some things that you've heard before. There's some things you might not have heard before. You might not have heard in the way I'm going to say it tonight. But either way, as I distill down on what it takes to really kind of raise your game and up your level on being a good nature photographer, these are the things I think about all the time. So that's what I'm going to share with you. One of the things I do all the time when I present these webinars is always include pictures from some of my latest workshops. So that's what you're going to see tonight. This was in Death Valley that we did back in February, workshop out in Death Valley, and this was some of the night shots we did. Uh, had a full moon night. We took advantage of that. We let the moon do the light painting and then did really slow exposures so we get the streaks of the cloud. That was all on purpose. For a purposeful look, one of my favorite times to shoot pictures is at night. And so that's one of the techniques I've learned along the way. And it's always fun to share that with people. And so in this webinar, you're going to learn a few things. Number one, you're going to learn the five essential skills to improve your nature photography. Again, like I said before, some of them aren't rocket science. They're all pretty common stuff that you may or may not have thought about before. You may not have thought it in the way I'm going to talk about it tonight. And so again, try to set your mindset up to start thinking differently about improving your photography. And number two, more importantly, I'm going to give you some practice protocols to give you actionable items that'll help get you started in some really specific ways on how you can practice to improve your skill set in these areas that we're going to talk about. This picture here was from a Everglades workshop, and when we were in Death Valley, we really timed it right this year. We were there that had a lot of winter rains, and so we were there and actually in Badwater Basin. If you've ever been there before, that's the lowest. If you've ever been there before, you know what I'm talking about. If you've never been there before, it's one of the lowest places in it's in the world. It's the lowest place in the continental United States. It's 282 feet below sea level, but that thing had caught water, and now instead of being Badwater Basin, it's called Lake Manly. And we're also there for the big wildflower bloom. But when we turn around well, before that trip, earlier in the month, I was in the Florida Everglades, and they had a couple things that happened there in regards to weather that fell on our side. Number one, that had a dry winter, which the reason why I go when I do in February, it's the dry season, I know, but it'd been particularly dry this year. And so because of that, the water holes were drying up, which pushed all the fish and all the feed to smaller areas, which made the birds more concentrated. But the week before we got there, they had a pretty hard freeze, and some of the non-native fish that lived in some of these water holes succumbed. They died. And so because of that, a lot of these fish were floating on the top, which made it a lot of easy meals for stuff like wood storks to go in and feed on them. So we got a lot of really good pictures of wood storks feeding with fish in the mouth, everything else. And so I tell that story to say in contrast, last fall, the weather was actually too good. Every time we'd go out in the evening, whether I was on a workshop or taking pictures for myself, the skies were always blue, not a cloud in the sky. And, it kind of gets boring as photographers. We want a little drama in the sky. And so because of that, went through the fall with, not spectacular fall colors on all the places I went. And the skies were never very interesting. And then starting about December, things started to change. And so far since then, everything, everything has been really, really, uh, looking up. I mean, we've just had great conditions whenever we've gone out. And so as we talk about the five things, I want you to understand these like they're silos. Like think about the grain silos you see out in the country and they store grain. Some of these things we'll talk about, you'll have maybe a good understanding of one silo. Your silo will almost be full, but maybe in another one it may not be quite as full. And I'll kind of explain that more in depth later. And so I think if you're being honest with yourself, I'm being honest with myself when I say this, as we talk about our skill set in various aspects of photography, you should recognize there's things you can be better at and there's things you can use improvement on. And I think absolutely for me, there's things I can use improvement on and be better at. And so as I talk through these things, just think about which one you need to improve upon. Some of them you may not need to, but some of them I think, again, if you're being honest with yourself, you definitely will, because I know some of these things I need to improve upon. And but the first thing we talk about, that first silo of knowledge, is an absolute understanding of the fundamentals of photography. I can't stress that enough. You know, I told a story earlier today that I really equate sports to photography a lot because sports players know that they've got to have a good fundamental understanding of the game they play. For example, golf. If you've listened to very many of my webinars before, I've used this same example. If you put me on the course with the greatest golfer in the world, let's say it's Rory McIlroy, and you were to give me all the latest tech, I can drive a golf cart wherever I go, so there's no fatigue. I can I can use the best balls, the best shoes, the best gloves, the best clubs, the best everything made known to man, the latest tech. You could put that in my hand. And then if you gave Rory McIlroy a set of golf clubs that were made in 1960 that you bought third hand from a garage sale and you made us compete together, who's going to win? And it's always going to be Rory McIlroy because he's got a better understanding of the fundamentals of the game. Now, photography, unless you compete in a lot of contests, isn't necessarily a competitive sport. But if you're like me and you kind of compete with yourself and you just want to be better for the sake of creating beautiful pictures, then you do kind of compete with yourself. And the way to get better is understanding the fundamentals of photography. The technology helps. It, I won't deny that, but the technology is not all it's cracked up to be in the end. When I mean technology, I mean camera technology and software technology. Somewhere along the way, those can help improve your photography, but to really kind of start off on the right foot and really understand cause and effect. You're in the field. If I set the camera this way, what's going to happen? And that's understanding the fundamentals of photography. And I'll be real specific about what I mean by fundamentals here in a second. And so it allows you to make decisions when you're in the field if you understand the fundamentals. What should the shutter speed be? What should the ISO be? What should the aperture be? All those things, you're just able to do it because you understand the fundamentals. You don't have to think about it. You know, the greatest hitters in baseball never think about every little bit of their swing when they're swinging. They've just got it muscle memory and they just know what to do when the time comes. And really, as photographers, I think that's where we want to be is when the time comes and the action happens, do you instinctively know what to do and how to set your camera so you can capture that action? And that's part of what I mean by the fundamentals. This is Lake Manly, some of the salt formations in the Badwater Basin in Death Valley. So the fundamentals as I describe them are really break down into four things, but I'm going to share with you three. And again, each one of these things make a whole webinar up in itself. And so as I talk through this, if you've got any ideas for webinars you want to see in the future, feel free to drop me a line. I'll share my email address at the end. And then feel free to drop me a line and I'll include those ideas if we get enough consensus that that's what y'all want to see. And so the first fundamental is shutter speed. You know, people I've found as they're learning photography, they've got a pretty good understanding that to stop the action, you need to have a faster shutter speed, 1/1000th, 1/2000th of a second faster. Conversely, they kind of understand if you have a slow shutter speed, like a second, 2 seconds, or whatever, it's really good at accentuating motion, like blurry water or waterfalls falling over a crest, and just to make all that blurry, they really have a good understanding of that. But it seems like there's a no man's land in the middle that people really don't understand about shutter speed. When's it appropriate to use 1/60th of a second? When should you use 1/15th of a second? When should you use 1/500th of a second? Well, as you understand shutter speed and you understand the fundamentals of photography more, you're able to solve those problems when you're in the field and understand there's a whole range of shutter speeds you can use to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish and to be able to get the shot along the way. Same way with aperture. You know, when I learned to take pictures, one of the ways I learned was looking at Sports Illustrated magazine, and I love that look of like Nolan Ryan pitching a baseball, and you see the baseball out in front of his hand, it'd be out of focus, and then the background would be really out of focus, and Nolan Ryan would be perfectly in focus, and that look enamored me back in the '80s when I first started learning how to take pictures. And so I sought to learn that, and it's a trick of it's a couple things. It's using the proper aperture, and then it's understanding the how the distance from the background to the subject impacts the way the out of focus areas are going to look. It's as simple as that. And so instinctively, like shutter speed, a lot of people kind of understand f2.8 or f4 and what that means. And they also understand f16 and f22 and what that means. But there, a lot of times it feels like, and this is anecdotal when I say this, but a lot of times it feels like that in the middle, that f8, f11, when should you use that? Well, there's times to use it. And so these aren't real good examples how I used it, but in Death Valley, because they're in the midst of a super bloom, one of the things we want to do is get pictures of a of the flowers. And so I shot this picture where I I wanted the I composed it where I knew I wanted the flowers in the foreground to be in focus, and I wanted the mountains in the background to be in focus too. And so understanding aperture and understanding shutter speed guided my selections on that. Shutter speed, it really didn't matter what it was going to be. It was going to be what it was going to be. But I knew if I shot that at f22, I'd be able to get that kind of depth of field I'm looking for. Conversely, on the bison, the background really didn't matter much to me. It was just a wide out background. This is in winter in Yellowstone back in early February. The background really didn't matter so much to me, but what mattered was getting good detail in that bison. And so I knew I didn't have to shoot it at f22. I also need to be a little bit nimble because the bison would move and I wanted to freeze that action in case he did. So I knew I had to shoot at a little bit higher shutter speed. And to get a higher shutter speed, I just knew you can accomplish that by shooting at a wide open aperture like f4 or f5.6. Now, if you really look at this critically, the eyes are in focus of that bison, but as it moves back towards its hip, it starts becoming out of focus. Hip doesn't matter, didn't need to be in focus. Really, what I wanted to be in focus were the eyes and have detail in the face and the eyes. And so uh, because of that, I let that kind of guide my aperture setting. I set it at f5.6 and I had the ISO set. And because of the way I shoot and aperture priority, I let the camera decide what the shutter speed was going to be. Made a little bit of a tweak on it because it's a white background and I had to add exposure compensation. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But just because of that, it's just a decision I made. But again, that's not anything I had to deliberate over in my mind because I've got a pretty good understanding of the fundamentals. Then uh, I just knew instinctively to get to the point I wanted it to be, to get from point A to point B. I knew the direction I had to take to be able to get there and the settings I had to make. And then the third thing on the ISO third thing on fundamentals is just understanding what ISO means and understanding that there's a time to shoot low ISOs and there's a time to shoot high ISOs. But like shutter speed and aperture, a lot of people get confused about, go, okay, what about in the middle? I mean, when should I shoot at 800 or 1000 ISO? Or when can I back it off to 320? Or just all those decisions that you need to make along the way if you understand the function of ISO. And by the way, these things, if you hadn't figured out, it's the exposure triangle. We've all heard about that before. It's the interplay of how shutter speed, ISO, and aperture all play together. It's kind of like Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's the equal and opposite reaction. Well, if the ISO stays static, then when you change the aperture, if you open it up to let more light in, the shutter speed necessarily has to go higher. The opposite's true. If you shut the aperture down lower, stop down f16, then the shutter speed to achieve proper exposure necessarily has to go slower. And then if you end up changing the ISO, it changes the whole mix. So all three are dependent upon one another. And just understanding that is a good path to the fundamentals of photography. And then the last part of this that I won't really talk about, because again, this is a whole other webinar in itself, and I've actually done one on this, is just proper camera handling techniques. There's a right way and a wrong way to hold a camera. I've always been an advocate of using tripods when you can, because it's the one piece of tool, the lowest tech piece of tool that's going to make your photography a whole lot better. And so one thing to keep in mind too, when you're photographing any subject, you're usually just photographing the light hitting that subject. So in other words, I'm looking outside right now and there's lights on the trees. Well, the light hitting the tree is the same intensity of the light hitting the wood pile that's right outside my window right here. And so if you understand that theoretically, because it's the same light hitting both places, one's not shadowed, one's in full sunlight, as long as they're in the same type of light, no matter where the subject is, theoretically, it ought to be the same shutter speed, no matter how you set your, I mean, no matter how you initially set your camera. And so one of the things that really taught me how to read light early on was I was exchanging messages with someone about this a couple of weeks ago was I actually got a handheld light meter. A long, long time ago, someone gave me one, and it took me a while to understand that, yeah, if the light hitting my hand is in full sunlight, and then there's a deer out in the pasture in full sunlight, theoretically, those two exposures ought to be exactly the same, or whatever falls in that meter ought to be exactly the same. Now, if one's in the shadow, it changes things, but theoretically, they should be the same thing. So at that point, I learned don't worry about the background, don't worry about if it's bright or dark. If you're focusing on a particular subject, like a deer or like some other kind of animal, you're usually just photographing the light hitting that subject. And so when you start to understand that, it really does change your approach and it simplifies the approach on how to go about achieving a proper exposure. And so, as we all know, as nature photographers, things in nature are sometimes messy and they're not perfectly lit all the time. And you just have to understand how to solve those problems when you're in the field. So, here's a practice protocol for you. Here's some actionable things that you can do immediately to start getting into practice a little better. A neutral tone stuffed bear makes a really nice model. And when I say neutral tone is, you may have heard this phrase before, 18% gray. If you think about a histogram, on the left, it's purely uh, it's I may have this backwards because I'm doing this from memory. On the left, it's purely uh dark or black. On the right, it's purely white. And so you got black on the left, right on the white on the right, and right in the middle is 18% gray. So middle tone animal, a neutral tone animal like a teddy bear is a good 18% gray to work with. And so I used to do this all the time when I was learning exposure and working through these mental gymnastics and trying to figure this out. There's a teddy bear like I'm talking about. Just go out and buy you a teddy bear if you got one at home, use it and put that teddy bear in different lights. It's a good practice protocol for learning things like backlighting. Backlighting is a great tool to use if you're trying to light wildlife or people or whatever. It's a good way of, we're all taught to keep the sun at your back, but sometimes you can't control that. Well, if you've got a deer against a dark background and you've got it backlit and it's still a wonderful picture you can take, well, how do you handle that? What do you need to set your settings at? And by experimenting with the bear, it's going to allow you to practice these things and just understand how to solve that problem when you get into the field, or understand how to solve a problem like this. When we were in Florida, we had a whole bunch of white pelicans swimming against a dark background, and the background was completely dark in the shadow. And so what we did, and you got to know how to handle it. It's a white subject on a dark background. Well, instinctively, you just know how to do it if you've done it enough, if you practice with your bear. Or front lighting is another way to experiment. How does the exposure change if it's a middle tone animal sitting in front of a dark background, or how does it change when it's sitting in front of a bright background, or how does it change when you backlight it or front light it? But if you go through all those scenarios, it really, really does help you understand what to do when you're in the field and how to solve those photographic problems and how aperture affects the way the background looks. This is one of the first things I started figuring out. I mentioned that before. How does the background look? Uh, and how does the background look and how does changing the aperture or the distance between the subject and the background make a difference on how the background is going to look? Now you can't see it from here, but right outside my window to the right, I've got what I call the world famous hummingbird stick. And so I've got a stake in the ground that holds a feeder, and hanging off the stake, I've attached a stick that hummingbirds, when they come in to feed, a lot of times they'll land on that stick. And that stick is there for a purposeful reason because I know people like this look. I know people like really out of focus backgrounds. If you focus on that stick, if you're doing it, if the sun's at your back and you're front lighting a hummingbird as it lands on the stick, the background is going to be really soft, creamy, out of focus. It's just a perfect background. If you backlight it, if you go to a different time of the day and you shoot from, the sun's at the west and you shoot back towards the west trying to backlight a hummingbird, it's going to do the same thing. You get the background's a real long way away and it's going to be a nice, creamy background. And so thinking about backgrounds all the time, in my mind, if I think back, because I've had a lot of magazine covers, hundreds of magazine covers, and I think back to how had all those covers, and this one reason is I unlocked the secret. I just knew what editors were looking for, and part of that was they wanted really neutral areas in the background to put text on top of. And so I uncracked that secret early on, and even today, I mean, I've had I don't know, maybe half a dozen magazine covers already this year, and it's just because I understand that formula. But it's one thing I learned by doing that bear experiment way back in the day and wondering, okay, if I set the bear here and the background's way off and I've got it set at F4, what's it going to look like? What's it, how's it going to look in the end? And I used to, back in the day when I'd experiment with film, I would use print film to do my experiments with because it was cheaper to use and it was easier I could get it back quicker. I could take it to Walmart and get it developed in an hour. But now with digital, man, you can see especially with mirrorless now, you can see the results instantly, and it changes the learning curve, and you're able to really learn those fundamentals of photography like we talked about. So earlier we talked about the different silos of knowledge, the five silos of knowledge we're going to talk about in ways that you can improve. Like number one, uh, the fundamentals. I feel like I've got a really good understanding of the fundamentals of photography. I can solve most vexing photographic problems when I'm in the field without having to think about it too much. It's muscle memory. But the second one, I will concede that maybe my silo is only half full is when it comes to post production. I will concede, not that it's a competition, and I don't mind conceding. I will gladly concede that there's a whole lot of people that are better at post processing than I am. My philosophy has always been try to get it right in the camera, do as least post processing as you can to try to get it where it's ready. And so that's still how I think about things. Part of that mentality comes from I used to shoot film and you had to get it right in the camera. Secondarily, I shoot a lot of pictures every year, and that's just a lot of post processing that would bog me down if I really wanted to spend a lot of time on each picture. So I do. I try to get it right as much as I can, and then have my set of tools in my toolbox, so to speak, that I can tweak the images that I want to and not spend an excessive amount of time on each image. And that's just how I think about things. And so because I think that way, there's a whole lot of things on post processing that probably I don't do as good as I should. But the one thing we're going to talk about too, if you have a good post-production workflow and you've got that committed to memory, it's going to help you solve a lot of problems when you're in the field. So in other words, you take a picture and if there's some problems with it in the field, you just instantly know, okay, if I do this in post-processing, I'll be able to correct that. Let me go backwards right quick for you. This this picture right here of the flowers in Death Valley. When I shot that picture, I had a couple of decisions to make because number one, the flowers in the rock were already in the shade. The mountains, as you can see in the background, were in the sun, and so you can either expose for the light or expose for the shadow. And so cameras are getting better at this dynamic range, but this had a little bit of a dynamic range to it. If I expose for the flowers, the mountains would blow out. If I expose for the mountains, then the flowers would be really dark. And so I had a decision to make. And my decision was pretty simple. I knew because of my post-processing workflow and the tools I had in my toolbox that I could go in and lay a graduated, a linear, what do they call it in Lightroom? A graduated neutral density filter is what I call it, but just a linear gradient is what they call it. Linear gradient filter. I could lay that linear gradient in there and then darken just that area of the sky that I need to darken to make the whole exposure match. I knew I had that in my toolbox, and so I took the picture the best way I thought I could. It didn't look as good in the camera, but I knew when I got it back in post processing, I could shine that baby and make it look a lot better. Let me get back to my slides here. It's easy to go backwards on these things, but it's a little slower to go forward. Okay, if you have a good post-production workflow, it's really your secret sauce to knowing what's possible in the field. There's sometimes when no matter how hard you try, there's not much you can do to make a good picture in the field. Good example of that is let's say you see a black bear and it's standing timber and it's 12 o'clock in the afternoon on a bright sunny day. There's not a whole lot you can do to make that a good picture. It's because of the dappled light and all the other things going on. But there's times like I showed you on the flower picture, if you've got the mountains in the sun and the foreground's in the shade, you can expose for the shade. The mountains are going to be a little bit blown out, but you've got the tools to be able to fix that in post processing. And so that's what I advocate. Even on this picture here of this bald eagle when we're in Yellowstone, if it was really early in the morning, the light wasn't great, the sun hadn't peaked the mountains yet, it was really dark. So when I first saw it, it had a really snowy background behind it. And so one of the things I try to coach people on is if you've got a really bright background behind a bird that's in a tree, try to reposition yourself where you've got some color behind it. And that's what I did here. So I just repositioned myself where it's a drab color, but it's not just stark white. And so I shot the picture and I went ahead and shot it at a pretty high ISO, like, I don't know, 6,000 or something like that. And I knew it was going to be noisy, but I knew in my toolbox back at home, I would have the tools to be able to denoise it and make it look decent in the end. And so that's what I did here. So that was the tool in the toolbox. So here's my primary workflow when it comes to Lightroom. Once I get images into Lightroom Develop, into the Develop module, I use Auto to give me a starting point. The Auto Develop, and it is. Lightroom is getting so good. And I use Lightroom because that's what most people use. So I think I know how to use some other software solutions as well. And they'll pretty much all do this, but Lightroom is the standard, I think, which most people go by. But Lightroom is a really good place it gives I mean, using auto in Lightroom gives you a really good place to start. It'll give Lightroom's opinion about where it thinks it ought to be. And so what I'll do is hit auto first, and then secondarily, I'll go back in and make any adjustments I need to. So I use it as a starting point. Most adjustments I make, and this is anecdotal, I've never measured this, but just thinking about what I usually have to do. If Lightroom gets anything askew, it's usually the exposure, and I have to go back and adjust the exposure because Lightroom doesn't know that you're taking pictures of snow. It doesn't know you're purposely trying to overexpose an image because of the snow. It doesn't know you're purposely trying to underexpose an image because if it's got a dark background like these pelican you saw a while ago. And so it doesn't know. And so a lot of times you have to adjust that. And then after I do the exposure adjustment, if needed, I look at the blacks, the shadows, the whites, or the highlights, just all the basic stuff in that one menu, and I adjust it where it's needed. Most of the time, that's usually pretty good. Again, it gives me a good starting point. I'm trying to be a really sort of realistic look at my pictures and really sort of I don't really go I try not to go all out and doing some funky colors or funky finishes. It's just pretty much a faithful representation of what I saw in the field. And I don't I'm not and I'm not slamming anybody that does, so don't take this as a veiled insult at anybody. But I'm not chasing Facebook likes or Instagram likes or anything like that. So I'm not trying to really kind of play that game, the oversaturated game that you need to on some of those platforms. My mind is still like working with magazines. You give a pretty faithful representation. It's like truth in advertising. You give a pretty faithful representation. And if they want to do any more color correction, then they take care of that themselves. I just try to present it as close as it was the way I saw it in the field. And so uh, once I'm done with my primary workflow, my secondary workflow, after I do all those basic adjustments, then I start thinking about the tools in my toolbox. Do I need to use a graduated ND filter or a linear gradient? I misnamed that on this one. Or do I need to use a linear gradient to add a little pop of color to the top of the sky where it may be overexposed or bring the exposure down a little bit? Do I need to use a radial gradient like in the case of, I didn't use it on this one, but like in the case of that windmill, if I wanted to brighten those blades up a little bit, I could have dropped a radial gradient in there. One of the things too that radial gradient works great at is if you've taken a picture of wildlife and their eyes a little dark, put those radial gradients on each eye, adjust the exposure up a little bit, give a little pop and a little shine to the eye. Makes a huge, huge difference. So I consider using that. Notice I say consider because I don't always use them. Then I'll consider any kind of remove tools, like is there a highline wire or anything else that's distracting that I need to take out? again, I try to avoid those things as much as I can in the field, but I realize sometimes you can't avoid them. So then, do I need to do any of that? And then usually I just, do I need to use denoise or any kind of lens correction tools in Lightroom to fix it? It's really those are the basic things I do. And as I keep those in my mind when I'm in the field, it helps me solve those problems. If I'd have shot this picture and wanted, and if I would expose for the moon on this one, but if I'd exposed for the windmill, the moon would have been blown out. Well, I just knew I could go back and use a brush filter to be able to go over the moon and make that moon the exposure it ought to be. I just knew I could do that. And when you have that knowledge when you're in the field, then it really does make the problem solving aspect a lot easier because if you take it one way, you can go solve that problem when you get home. And I think that's the way that the technology is meant to be married to each other is you do the best you can in the field and then you just sweeten it up when you get back home in post processing. And so here's a practice protocol for how you can conquer number two. Early on, I used to not make a note on my phone. I used to make notes on note cards and leave them in my camera bag to help me remember all these things I need to do. This was before smartphone in the early days of digital, and in the latter days of film, I do the same thing. But when digital started, I would make a note on my phone to remember all those post-processing protocols we can do as a field reminder. Now it's even better because we have more protocols that we can do. There's more things that we can do in an image to help bring it back or to make it like we saw it in the field. And so when I would make the handwritten notes, it was before we had smartphones, but now we have smartphones. You can put those notes on your phone and be able to find them in an instance. Just as a reminder, at some point, if you refer to your notes enough, you're just going to remember what you can do, and it becomes muscle memory at that point. And then again, refer to it when you're in the field to help you guide you on any kind of problem solving that you ought to do. Number three, again, if we're thinking silos, where I said my silo on my fundamental knowledge is pretty full, I could improve my knowledge of post processing. I could fill that silo more. Fieldcraft is something you're never going to fill. You're gonna never going to fill your silo on for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's too much to know. And number two, animals are animals and they're going to do what they're going to do. So, but fieldcraft, if you know a little bit of fieldcraft, if you know your animals you're trying to photograph, it really does help predict your future. And so one of the first things on fieldcraft is just understanding animal behavior. It's a good place to start. I did a webinar about this last week for the Journal of Wildlife Photography, and that's what I kept telling them. It's just really a good way for you to really watch an animal in the field and just have a good understanding of what may come next. And so I'm going to share with you a case study in a minute, exactly how it happened. And so here's the scenario for you. My dog goes to the front door and he just stands there. What do you think's going to happen? What do you think that he wants? He's telling me he wants outside. He's got to go to the bathroom. And so that's a little bit what I mean by predictive behavior. So I'll tell you more about this picture here in a little bit. And so by taking the time to learn animal behavior, it helps you hone some valuable skills when it comes to nature photography. Number one, it teaches you the value of anticipation. One of the biggest skills that you can learn as a wildlife photographer is just anticipating the action. Because a lot of times the action happens fast and you're not ready for it and you miss the shot. And so by learning animal behavior, again, it's not 100%, this is not 100% uh, of the time it's going to work, but the stuff really does work. If you understand, you can anticipate what's about to happen. I'm going to tell you that story in a minute. It also gives you the chance of projection. So what I mean by that is, if I see my dog headed towards the front door, I'm anticipating maybe what he's going to do next. And then when he gets to the front door and stop, I'm going to make the projection that he wants to go outside. And so I'm going to open the door for him and let him outside. And so it gives you a chance not only anticipate what's going to happen, but to say this, if this animal does A, then B is going to happen. It gives you a chance to project it. And the more you know, the better you get at this. And then patience. I wrote a story for a magazine, came out in January, and it was kind of aimed at sort of everyone who's got some sort of passing interest in wildlife photography. And one of the things I told them, the key thing is you got to have patience, you know. Sometimes things work out for you. A lot of times animals are animals. They're going to move when they're going to move, and sometimes it doesn't. And so another thing it teaches you is the value of patience. This old saying is so true when it comes to wildlife. If you're, and I'm not going to say it's going to be this way all the time, but this is the way I lean most of the time. If we're at a spot and we see a black bear out in the field, and that black bear is just kind of milling around. He's laying down. He's not doing much. You know, the old thought in mind, what if we drive down the road? Is there a black bear closer? Well, you don't know because a bird in the hand is better than two in the bush. If you know what's there, if you've got the patience to wait on it and you can watch it and, you know, you can anticipate and project what may happen next and you've got the patience to throw in there, then sometimes it's best just to wait out an animal and see what's going to happen. Because a lot of times you never know. They may get up and walk straight towards you and be a whole lot closer. And then probably the most important thing, the skill you learn is the skill of curiosity. You know, the better I get at this skill set when it comes to nature photography, the more I want to learn about the next animal I don't know so much of. You know, you again, using Yellowstone as an example, you go to Yellowstone and you take a picture of the pikas and you go to a place where you're going to see pikas and you know when you first look at it, it's like playing whack-a-mole. You just don't know where they're going to pop up and you don't know how often they're going to pop up. And so out of curiosity, the first time I saw them, is there any kind of ideas I can use to sort of increase my odds of getting pictures of these? And yeah, I noticed that when they would pop up, a lot of times they'd have their favorite rock. And so if I just waited that favorite rock, a lot of times they'd come up on it. They'd be there for just 5 or 10 seconds. I'd be ready, take pictures, and they'd move on. But just out of curiosity and wanting to learn more, I think the curiosity is the best skill to have because it makes you want to learn more. You get motivated to learn more uh, today with our smartphones and our access to things like Wikipedia or some of the nature sites that will teach you about animals, it's just a great resource to have and a great way to learn when you're on the go and in the field. You know, I failed to mention this, but since I saw these birds, I remember a couple of pretty basic fieldcraft ideas almost everybody knows, especially when it comes to like anticipation. If you see a bird sitting on a limb and it takes a poop, almost everybody that's ever shot animals have heard this before. You know what's going to happen next. He's probably about to take off. But if you take the wind into effect and you're trying to figure out where these birds are going to land, then you can project the way they're going to land because you know birds always take off and land into the wind. And you can project which way they're going to come in and set yourself up in the best uh, possible position to get the shot that you're looking for. And so here's my case study I was talking about. And this case study was part of the journal webinar I did last week. And it's actually out of my Yellowstone trip I did back in early February, and I call it the Jumping Coyote. So we were in Hayden Valley in a snow coach, and in the distance we saw a couple of coyotes that were hunting together in the field, and one coyote broke off from another, and I knew just based on uh, my knowledge of coyotes, I don't know everything there is to know about coyotes. I'm not a biologist. I have a degree in agriculture, and so I can't even tell you what cows are going to think most of the time. But I knew in my knowledge of coyotes that I'd learned not only from reading in books, but also experience watching them. They hunt into the wind. And so one of them turned right into the wind and it started hunting up this little seam of landscape, this low area. And I told everybody, I said, that coyote may, if we wait here, that coyote, because when we first saw them, they're a long way off. I said, if we wait here, that coyote may end up coming up right next to us. It may come up right there. And sure enough, I was right. Came, 40 yards away from us, just right in front of us, and we're watching it. And so at first, the coyote's just cruising along, minding its own business, kind of in a slow trot. Again, it's hunting into the wind. The reason why predators hunt into the wind is they want the wind in their face, so the wind is blowing from the prey to them and they can smell it. If it's the opposite, if the wind's blowing from their butt past their head towards the prey is going to smell them, and they're going to be able to hide before they see them. So, predators like coyotes and bobcats use the element of surprise to sneak up on their subjects, and they always hunt into the wind, or they almost always hunt into the wind. And so because he was hunting into the wind, I was watching for one particular movement, and then he did it right there. And I'll go back one. You can see his head's kind of low, ears are erect, head's low, eyes are wide open. Then all of a sudden, he heard something. If you've got a dog or a cat, you've seen them do this before when they get curious about something. He stopped for just a second, cocked his head, and his eyes narrowed just a little bit. And he did this for maybe 5 to 10 seconds. And I told everybody that was standing around me, I said, get ready. I think you're about to see a pounce. Because he had locked in on something he had heard. He was ready for it. And then, sure enough, thanks to the miracle of everybody being ready and pre capture, that came in handy too. Everyone got the complete sequence of this jump. And I could show you all the pictures, but I didn't see any really need to. But everybody got the complete sequence of this jump from beginning to end. And this is just my favorite one of all of them. Because I had a good handle on the fundamentals of photography, that first silo, I was able to know how I should set my camera beforehand. Number two, because I had a pretty good understanding of the post-processing options, which this one really didn't take much. I knew kind of what I needed to accomplish. And then number three, because I had some semblance of field craft and I knew a little bit about animal behavior just from time in the field and going out and practicing it, I was ready for this moment and told everyone else to be ready for it. And I'm not going to say I took this picture. I'm going to say we took this picture as a group. Everyone that was there with us that day was standing right beside us and we all took the same shot. And it's a remarkable shot. I've taken a lot of coyote pictures and right now this is my favorite of all of them. And you can see the tech specs there. I shot a Canon R5 Mark II camera. That's what I shoot, it's Canon camera. A Canon 500 millimeter EF lens. I've had that lens forever. It weighs a ton, but it's such a good lens, and Canon hadn't remade it yet. I bet I've had that lens 20 or 25 years. It's the old version. A 1.4 teleconverter. I shot this at 1/2000th of a second at f5.6. And remember, I talked about that earlier. I knew a shallow depth of field with the background far off would render the kind of background that I think is most aesthetically pleasing in pictures. And that's what I did there. But look at the ISO. All I needed was 320. Shot at low ISO, so that saved me a step in the post-processing. I don't have to do any kind of noise reduction or anything else. And then I know because based on experience, if pictures have a bright background like snow, cameras will almost always tend to underexpose an image. And so I knew because the camera would tend to underexpose that I had to add light back to it. So I had to dial +1 in exposure compensation. And you can do that. You can do that in manual mode. I shoot in aperture priority. That's the mode that's always worked best for me. Again, in the spirit of Russell proofing things with aperture priority, I set my ISO. All I have to worry about is what aperture I want to set, and then the camera sets the shutter speed. Most of the time, the camera will get the shutter speed right, but in times when you have a bright background like snow, or a dark background like shadows, I just know from experience that it's either going to be a +1 if you're taking pictures on the snow or a -1 if you're shooting pictures against a really dark background. Like the pelican picture we showed a while ago, that was a -1 just to get because the background overwhelmed the space in the scene, and because it did that, the camera would tend to overexpose it. It would blow out the pelican, and it would I think I said crane earlier. It would blow out the pelican and it would cause the shadows not to look like shadows. It would try to bring detail into the shadows. And so just knowing that stuff, understanding the fundamentals, helped me make the decisions on the camera setting before the action even happened. And then understanding a little bit of fieldcraft and knowing what I was looking at and being able to predict accurately what that coyote was about to do, then it helped create this picture. Now, you could argue and say, and it's a valid argument, you could say, well, the coyote might not have did that. A broken clock is right twice a day. But yeah, as long as you know a broken clock is correct twice a day, that's okay too. Because with me, I just knew when I saw that movement, there's a pretty good chance we're about to see a pounce. And if he wouldn't have done it, we still got cool pictures of him cocking his head. But the fact he did do it, everybody was ready. Everybody got the shot. Hmm. And so here's some practice protocols for you. Pick an animal or two and start studying what you can about that animal's behavior. So in other words, my favorite animals are deer species and I like wild turkeys. And so one of the things I've committed myself to is learning about deer species. A good example here, this is a desert mule deer, We saw this in Bosque del Apache. This may be one of the finest examples of a desert mule deer you've ever seen. It's almost like a unicorn in the fact that it's got those double drop tines that hang off the beams, and it's got the extra points that stick off to the side. They call them sticker points. So it's got the extra stickers, it's got the extra drop tines. I've seen thousands of desert mule deer in my life. You'll see this some in Rocky Mountain subspecies of mule deer, but in desert mule deer, it's a pretty rare phenomenon. And just to see this and recognize how special that animal uh, was just a treat to behold. Now, when we spotted the animal, it was making a rub, and you can see the wood shavings in its antlers. It was rubbing its antlers against a tree, a common thing that animals do like that, bucks do like that during the breeding season. And you can see by how thick his neck is and how robust his shoulders is, it was during the rut. He was looking for a mate. So he was trying to strengthen up in case he got into a fight. That was his daily workout. But he went, and this is how quick animals change their mind. He went from making the rub to immediately, for no reason, nothing we did. He just turned and decided it was time to leave, and he was standing in water when he was making the rub. So he did his mule deer bound through the water, and he was making his way through the water. I told everybody, because I've seen deer do it so many times, get ready, because a lot of times, whatever spooked him, he's going to stop and take a look back at it. So be ready, because that deer is going to get to high ground and he's going to stop. And sure enough, just because I understood that habit of deer and I understand their creatures of habits, that's exactly what he did. And turned out what spooked him was there was a person down the road that was out of a car. He didn't really mind us because we're all right by the vehicle and we look like a vehicle to him, but someone walking down the road is what spooked him. But we were still able to get this shot of this mule deer right before he left and left our lives forever. And I'll probably never see him again. But I'm lucky we were there to see him when we saw him. And so pick an animal or two, start learning all you can about the behavior. There's all kinds of stuff you can learn, like all kinds of resources, books, websites, all kinds of stuff. If you look for it enough, you're going to find it. And then you'll start learning things like not about deer or turkeys, but wading birds like cranes. Cranes really do a really exaggerated version of it. Sandhill cranes, they'll often lean right before they take off. And so they'll test the wind and they'll lean into the wind. And then all of a sudden, if you wait long enough, if you see that lean, get ready because he's about to take off. And they almost always do. Or you may learn something like if a deer turns to look at you like it's curious about you, get ready because it may raise its foot up and give it a stomp. And a lot of times, just that one little bit of body English goes a long way of making that picture look a lot better. To me, that picture, because that deer has got that front right leg up a little bit, is a better shot than if he was standing all forward because he looks like he's anticipating about having to do something. And a lot of times in photo contests, it's those little things that make a big difference on how your pictures place. Okay, number four, this is where the rubber meets the road. Fundamentals, the fundamentals of photography, and you add it with a good understanding of composition. That's the space where the magic happens. That's the place we're all trying to get to. And knowing how to give an image a certain look is the ultimate key. So when you go in the field, just having that understanding of, okay, to capture this image, I need a 24 millimeter lens. I'm going to need to shoot it at f16 or f22 to get the most depth of field that I can to make sure everything's in focus. I may need to wait a few minutes or move my position to get the best lighting. And there's sometimes you can't figure out how to give things a certain look. I'll be the first one to admit. When it comes to landscape photography, there's just some landscapes I can't figure out how to make it look good. And, maybe I need to come back at a different time of the day. I may need to look at it different, may need to take a high angle, low angle, whatever the case may be. Uh, there's a way you can get a certain look in your pictures. And you do that by understanding fundamentals and then adding composition to it. And that's the intersection of magic. And so composition is a learned skill that everyone can improve upon. I mean, including me. When I look at my early pictures I took when I was 16 or 17, or a little bit older than that, I can tell you when I mastered the technical skills of photography, but it took a while to master the artistic skills. And so it's still a work in progress. Every time I go out and take pictures, I feel like I learn a little more and I get a little bit better. And I think that's really the key to staying humble and knowing we can all improve a little bit. Uh, the and I find too when I'm around people and the thousands of people I've had out to teach photography, That the technical skill usually comes first. It's usually the composition that people not I'm not going to say struggle with, but that's the learned skill that's a learning evolution. You just every time you go out and you're presented with a different scenario, it's you're presented with the new challenge of how to solve that photographic problem and how to understand that when you have a really good sky, you can have kind of a mundane sort of foreground and everything works together, you know. Uh, it's a good example I tell people all the time, pretty places are it's hard to make bad pictures of pretty places. Good example, if you've ever been to the Tetons before, you know what I'm talking about. If you've never been, there's a place called Mormon Row in Grand Teton National Park. And Mormon Row is this row of these old wooden barns that were built by Mormon settlers back in, I think, the late 1800s. And so you've got all the elements in a great landscape photo right there. You've got the barns in the foreground, and the background, you've got the four mountains that make up the Tetons. It's the whole Teton range, but you got the Grand Teton, the big one, and you've got all the other ones in that same four peak range. And all you have to do is show up, stand in this one spot because the composition kind of makes itself, and then wait for the sun to come up to bathe it all in magical light and shoot away. That's an easy composition to do. That's what I mean by it's hard to take a bad picture in a pretty place. Almost everybody can figure that out. But you go to other places like this, a little more sublime, like Death Valley. How do you do that? And so by learning composition and learning the different techniques you can use, that's how you accomplish that. You understand that if you're trying to take a picture of the super bloom as the sun's coming up, wait for that perfect moment when and get low when you can really accentuate the blooms across the field, and you wait for that perfect moment when the sun comes up, you can get a starburst. And all those things were pre-visualized in my mind. I knew what I was going to do before I even did it. And I knew the limitations of the scene. I knew that when I took this picture, the sky was going to be a little bit blown out. But because I remembered number two, I remember those tools I had in my post-processing toolbox, I knew I could add a linear gradient to the shot after the fact and be able to bring that sky down, add a little bit of color to it, and really make the picture pop. I'll tell you, I'll tell you about this in a minute. And this picture here, and there's another one, but this is, well, I'll tell you in just a second. There's another sister picture of that last one. And so a practice protocol for composition. If you're going somewhere familiar, like Grand Teton National Park or anywhere else, look at pictures that other people have done and use that for inspiration. I see no problem with copying someone else's especially as you're learning with copying someone else's composition. Because when it comes to national parks, for example, this land is your land, this land is my land. It all belongs to anyone, every one of us. There's no shame in shooting a similar picture to what someone else has went and done before. Because you're going to find out as you shoot pictures and you become more familiar with compositions, you're going to start finding compositions in similar landscapes that people have never seen before. And so look to other pictures that others have done and use that for inspiration. I went to Acadia National Park for the first time last fall. Never been there before. And so what do you think I did before I went? I looked at others, see what other people have done, found inspiration, found the good locations, went back to those spots and recreated stuff that people had already done before. And I do this a lot too. Make lookbooks of galleries or save web links for inspiration on your phone for field access. So I do this a lot with workshops. If we're doing like a Cowboys and Canyonlands workshop, for example, I will send people a gallery of 20 pictures that I've taken on that workshop before to just say, hey, look, this is what I've done in the past. And this may give you some inspiration of different pictures you can take on this week's workshop. It gives people a good place to start from if they really have no clue what they're looking for or what to do. And I think it's a good practice too to use those lookbook galleries, uh, just because again, if you get stuck on a composition or if you get stuck on an idea, you've got an idea book at your fingertips with that you can have field access and go back and look at and help jog your memory a little bit. And then I do this a lot. I critically think about compositions even when I'm not taking pictures. So I'll often look at stuff, especially around my property, and think, how could I take a picture of that and make it look good? Do I backlight it? Do I front light it? Do I side light it? Do I use rule of thirds? Do I shoot at shallow depth of field? What do I do? And I think about all those things continually on how to critically think about composition when I'm not taking pictures. And then I look at pictures and I try to think what it is do I like about them, and that includes other people's pictures too. Why do I like that? How does it line up with the rule of thirds? That's the basic compositional skill that rule that everybody knows. Uh, are there S curves? Are there triangles in the composition? Is the animal active or static? What are those particular things I like about those pictures? And the more you study it, the more intuitive that it becomes. I don't think that these things necessarily every time I'm in the field. After a while, it becomes muscle memory, it becomes more natural. But those are some things you can do to practice composition and just, again, continue improving your skill set on that. And so, back in Death Valley, I'll go to this one. I shot this picture. It was purposely backlit because I thought it would look cool to have those shadows coming towards the camera, plus just the shadows bouncing across the the octagonal shapes in the mud as well as the tracks that these rocks make. Uh, I thought would be intriguing. And then the last thing I tried to do was shoot at f/22 so I'd get that starburst because I wanted to give it a real kind of desert look. I wanted to look desolate and deserty. Even though the temperatures were mild, I wanted it to look kind of hot, and that's why I backlit this shot. But again, it's got S curves in it. I used the rule of third. I employed two or three different composition techniques to try to lead your eye into it because if you notice, that rock track leads right back into the sun, and all that was done on purpose. All that gets lined up on purpose, and that is a conscious thought when you're trying to line up for composition. But it comes with practice over time. Uh, if you don't know about this place, it's called the Racetrack Playa. And at the Racetrack Playa, up until about, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago, something like that, scientists didn't know what would cause these rocks to mysteriously move across that playa. They would just come out and all of a sudden there's rock tracks out there, but there's no people tracks around. The rocks would mysteriously move. And they think they figured out why. It's a perfect mixture of moisture and temperature and they think and wind. But I'm going to be honest with you about it. I think they've got a theory, but no one's ever seen it happen before, and I still have a lot of questions. I'm going to point you back to the trip report I released a couple weeks ago at Hackberry Farm. Look at that Death Valley trip report. You'll see some of the questions I still have about that. It's still a mysterious place and it's still a cool place to go see. And this is another one of the rocks there. But even that composition. Rule of thirds. I wanted to, it was on purpose where that rock was placed. And then you got the leading lines leading back to the mountains. That's the track it left. Even has that S curve in the rock, and you can see the triangles of the mountains, the third rule of thirds. All of those compositional things go into effect when I line up the camera there. Get through this right quick. And then number five, no matter what camera manufacturers tell you, and no matter what software manufacturers tell you, practice is the real equalizer. Really the only thing you're going to do to get better is practice. A 56-year-old Russell is a better photographer than a 50-year-old Russell because I've practiced at it. I've just stayed consistent with it. I've gone out and I've shot pictures and I've just stayed engaged in the whole process. And you learn to make mistake or you make mistakes and you learn from those mistakes and you keep going on. Technology has been a help. I can't deny that. I mean, I would not give up my cameras I have today for the cameras I had when I was 17 years old. Would never do it. But the cameras are just they assist me in doing the job I need to do. But it all comes back to those early lessons I learned in the fundamentals and then adding understanding fundamentals, understanding composition, adding a healthy dose of practice on top of that. That's how you get better. And that's just a universal rule that's always been true. Even when it came to if you're playing golf, the analogy I used earlier, the only way you get better is that you just go out and practice. Now, I forgot to redo this slide. I had my chance to redo it whenever I re-recorded this, but there should have been a 100% graphic right in the middle of that. And that 100% is supposed to say that's the certainty of you getting better if you just go out and practice. It's gonna happen. You're gonna get more comfortable with your camera. You're gonna understand the fundamentals better. You're gonna understand uh, the uh, composition better. You're going to remember those post-processing tools that you have in your toolbox back at home. You're going to get to observe animals and learn fieldcraft and understand if the animal does this plus this, what's the next expected step. You'll just be able to anticipate those things so much better, but it takes time to get there. It doesn't take an unlimited amount of time. I mean, you can do it. It just takes time getting out and practicing and just being a part of the mix. And so anyway, I can talk about practice protocols for practice, but there's not, that's redundant. The thing is, you just gotta get out and practice. That picture right there, that's about knowing the tools in your toolbox. That was on our Moonlight on the Prairie workshop we did earlier this month, and that was the total lunar eclipse we photographed out in Northwest Texas. And then this was White Sands National Park back in last December. And then I'm going to still say any questions you have because on the next slide, I'll share my email address with you again. Sorry for the having to re-record this, but I wanted to, I think had a lot of people sign up for this webinar today. I think almost 200 people signed up for it. I wanted to make sure that the people that weren't there live could still get access to the information. So this is not only for the ones that were there live and got to hear it live and got to hear what the questions were, but also for the ones who didn't get to hear it. This is for you. And so if you have any questions about anything I talked about, feel free to share them with me. I tell people all the time, I always get back in contact. Sometimes it may take me a day or two, but I always respond to emails. And so if you have any questions, russell@russellgraves.com. Please feel free to send me any questions you have, any comments you have, and I look forward to hearing from you guys in the future. Again, send those webinar ideas in. Love to hear them. And if any questions you have, send them on. I'll be sure to answer them for you and talk to you soon. Thanks for your support, everybody.